All right, so I'm going to be going over some of the review for Unit 5 mid-unit test, so it's the halfway point of Unit 5. I'm going to be going over some of the review stuff, as well as you only are doing Part 1, but I'm going to go over the stuff for Part 2 just so that you know it, because it can help you on Part 1. So you're only doing Part 1, but I will be talking about the questions for Part 2 just so that you can see them. And then the actual multiple choice questions will be in the ClassKick link that I will be sending out with the email as well. So I'll just be going over some review stuff really quickly, and then in the ClassKick we'll have actual questions to help you review. So getting into it, we're covering American Romanticism. And so we're going to talk about some of the key values that they talked about, or that they held high in romantic writing. We'll be comparing dark and bright romanticism, and then talking about the general what is romanticism. And so Renaissance refers to the flourishing of art and literature. So for the American Renaissance, so there was the Renaissance over in Europe, and it kind of flowed over to the Americas. During the American Renaissance is when a lot of our what we consider masterpieces were created. So the Moby Dick and all of those very popular classic American titles. Before that, literature was functional. It was Thomas Paine was writing his pamphlets. We were writing the Declaration of Independence. We were writing sermons to get a purpose across. They were used as something to help with survival, to help with politics, to get their point across, to teach. They weren't necessarily just for fun to read. And so this is where you'll notice a shift in the writing. I'm hitting down and it's not going down. There we go. So looking at the key values of a romantic writer, they valued individualism, self-reliance, and self-expression. So it was all about taking care of yourself and being able to express yourself and standing up for yourself and being your own person, which is a shift from what you noticed from the first few eras of American literature. Looking at bright romantic writers, also known as transcendentalism, they saw nature as, leading to the spiritual world, and nature was good. With that individualism and self-reliance, they rejected the conformity. They wanted to be unique. And so they kind of were rebellious and broke traditions and kind of downplayed the rules and did their own thing. They were their own people. Bright romantics also saw that men were innately good. They thought that men were good at the core, and they also thought that men could see that nature could be divine as well as themselves. So they could see that, and they were able to see God in nature and God within themselves. On the other end, you had dark romanticism, think Edgar Allan Poe. And so nature was also a key element of dark romantics, but on the opposite side. So in bright romantics, you saw that they saw it as divine and they saw it as good. Here, nature is a dark, mysterious power. Men can be full of evil. They're pretty much the opposite of bright romantics. So they thought men could be evil. They thought the divine was real but threatening. So they thought that God was very real, but he was kind of menacing, threatening. As far as emotions go, dark romantics played on guilt and fear a lot. And they thought that anybody that was optimistic was foolish and naive. So anybody that was optimistic was a fool. They were definitely morbid. And they were always talking about gloomy topics and concepts like death. In the Romantic era, it began in Europe, and it was basically, so it was just like, the era right before Romanticism was Enlightenment. So it was Benjamin Franklin who was talking about how to self-improve himself, and it was very cut and dry, bare bones writing. And so this was kind of a direct answer to that. The next era was like, I'm not doing that. We're going to write with flowery emotion. We're going to use imagination. We're going to describe things, use extra words. And so they were answering, it was directly reacting to that rational, logical writing that came right before them. And so some of the things that were pretty key for romantic writers: imagination over reason. So they preferred the imagination over logic. Sorry about that, I had to sneeze. And then they preferred the individual over society. So Benjamin Franklin was always talking about how you improve yourself for the good of society. In Romantic era, they're talking about improve yourself for yourself. Be your own person. Don't worry about society. They saw nature as spiritual nourishment. So they thought if you went out to nature, you were becoming closer to God. You were refreshing your soul. And then they basically thought that men were good, but were corrupted by society, which is a difference from beforehand where they all thought that you worked together to create a better society. Remember, rationalism was the belief that truth is arrived mainly through reason and observations. Huge difference between rational and romantic thinking. So we talked about this a couple days ago. The ways that you can create a believable character, and you are revealing the character through different ways. So there's direct characterization, which is where the author just states this is who the person is, this is how they think, this is how they act. They are a good person, they're a bad person. They are pushed and motivated by this. Other ways are indirect. So you're looking at the character's actions. You're looking at how they interact with other people and treat other people. You're looking at their thoughts and their words, and then you're looking at what others say about them. Okay, so these are what, if you had a part 2, this is what you would have had. You would have had 3 questions to pick from. And so these are the 3 questions to look at. You're not doing them, but it's nice to talk about them because they are good questions. So how does Poe use language to create mood in The Raven? Besides language, what other factors contribute to the mood of the poem? And then 2 additional factors, from whether it's rhyme and repetition, speaker's despair, the Raven, and the poem's conclusion. So you're looking at how does he use language to create mood in The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary. That's like one of the first lines. It might be the opening line. It's literally talking about how dreary the day is, right? And it talks about lonely, and it's weary and bleak and sorrowful. Definitely gives you a negative mood right off the bat in the first stanza. And it talks about how sad and lonely he was. So that's how he uses language. Additional factors. So he uses echoing elements such as internal rhyme and repetition of the word nevermore. So even though the bird says nevermore over and over and over, you understand that is that is an example of the desolation he feels and the hopelessness he feels, that he is never going to see his lost Lenore ever again. And so even though the bird's saying it, you understand that is reflecting, and it is showing his feelings over the loss of the love of his life. Another factor could be the gloomy mood, to talk about his despair. So we're going to talk about the speaker's despair as the second one. And so if you are thinking about how the Raven stays right above the chamber door and never moves. And so even though the Raven never moves and the speaker never moves, you see that he is just, based on the words that he uses, he's getting more and more despair driven, and by the end he fully believes that his soul is trapped within the shadow of that Raven. So it starts off with the Raven coming in, it doesn't move, the whole thing takes place in one room, but despite the fact that it doesn't move, his despair increases, and he eventually is just so distraught that he thinks he's basically lost his soul. Looking at the next one, the birthmark. In the birthmark, what does the birthmark represent for the two main characters, Elmer and Georgiana. At the end of the story, what does the birthmark come to symbolize? So for Elmer, it's imperfection in the beginning, and then later it's like evil itself, sin and evil. Georgiana, in the beginning, it was unique. It made her unique. It made her charming. All her beaux and people that came to call on her thought it was lovely. And then by the end, because of the way Elmer felt about it, she hated herself and was full of loathing for herself. And so it became a symbol of self-hatred. Ultimately, it symbolized life. It was on her cheek. She was full of life. When it gets removed from her, she loses life from herself and dies. So that's what that one represents. The third question, in America, the movement known as Romanticism took two forms: bright, also known as Transcendentalism, and then dark. What do Transcendentalism and dark have in common, and then how are they different? So we talked about this in the beginning. They are similar in some views, where they believed in intuition over reason, so they believed in emotions and instead of logic. And then they also thought that we're heavily steeped in nature and that you could learn from nature. But they saw two very different sides of learning from nature. So they saw that you could get the Transcendentalists thought that you had a more optimistic view, so they thought that nature and people were good and that you could learn from it, whereas dark romantics saw it as evil and dark. And so that was where they separated. So they both believed in nature as giving them like the opportunity to learn and the opportunity to hear from the divine, I guess is a good way to put it. But the light romantics were seeing the good of it. The darks were seeing the negative, the morbid side. So they also believed, the dark romantics believed that the world is full of evil and that humans reflect this in their desires and behaviors. They were more pessimistic. And they believed that the darkness in the human soul often destines people for despair and sorrow in their lives. Whereas the Transcendentalists were the more optimistic people, and they believed that we were good on the whole and destined to be good people. And that you were in charge of yourself and that you could make positive changes. So there's two very, very, very starkly different thoughts on romantics. Okay, like I said, the link for the multiple choice questions will have the class kick. Will be in the email that I am sending out with this video. So check that out for the multiple choice review questions.